Welcome to the 7th lecture in Module 5. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about the response side of the request-response protocol. In the last lecture, we talked about how the dispatcher takes a request and routes it to a particular controller action. And so here's an example. Here's an HTTP GET request, and if you start your Rails server on your blog app and then point it to localhost 3000, posts, and then do /1, what this will do is it'll route this particular request to the post controller class that you can find under app controllers, and it's going to pass the value 1 in using this params hash. And so you can access that value by looking at params and then :ID, and that should be passing the value 1 into your controller. Your controller will then use this to actually find that particular post. So again, this shows the file that this particular request will be routed to, and it will invoke the show method within this particular controller. And why does it invoke the show method? It's because of the way the routes are set up in your routes.rb file. So the show method will be invoked, and it will be provided with the ID of 1, and then the find method will be invoked on the post class, and the result will be returned to this post variable. So the @post variable is going to store the post that's returned from the request. And then finally, the controller is going to take the value that it extracted from the database, and it's going to provide it to the show.html.erb method. And that's under views posts in your application. So what happens is, because the show controller was invoked, it looks for a file called show.html.erb in order to render the appropriate HTML associated with that post. And then that's returned to the browser. So again, that's the overall process. So let's take a look at the show method that's inside the post controller. There's not much to it. It's a def, show, and end. It doesn't seem like it's doing much. Well, there's actually something else that's happening here. It looks like it doesn't retrieve the post when in fact it is, and that's because there's a filter that's applied before this method is called. And if you look at the top of the postcontroller.rb file, you'll see that there's this setPost method that's defined, and that's a filter. And the way that filters work is they allow the controller to run shared code that occurs either before or after every method is invoked. And in this case, it's called a before filter. And that setPost, what it does is it actually retrieves the post that you need for this method. The definition of setPost is actually provided at the bottom of your post controller file. So take a look at that. So inside the blog application, I've gone to app controllers and opened up post_controller RB, and here's the class post controller. And you see that there's a filter here that's executed before. It's a before action, so it's executed. This particular function is executed, but only for these particular methods: show, edit, update, and destroy. And here's the show method. Here's the edit. Update is here, and destroy is down here. And each of these requires a single post. So this setPost method is defined at the very bottom of this file under the private section of this class. And here it is, setPost. And what it does is this post class, which is an active record class, the find method is invoked on it, and the parameter that was supplied as a part of the URL, remember we had previously post /1, so this would be a 1 here, that it would find the post that has ID 1, and it would be retrieved. Active records would retrieve that from the database, and then it would assign that active record object to this @post instance variable. And that's the instance variable that then will be used inside of the show method, right? The edit method, the index method, and the destroy method. Now let's talk about sessions. Now in general, the state of an application should be persisted in your database. And it's very difficult to save things across requests. So As an example, the posts that are created, the comments that are created, they're saved in your database. But there are times when you need to save other types of state. As an example, if you're at a site and you're putting things into a shopping cart, but then you navigate away and maybe look at other things on that shopping site, when you come back, you don't want your you don't want your shopping cart to be gone. And so that's an example of when you need to persist something that's maybe not necessarily already stored in the database. Sessions can be used to do that. And whenever a user connects to a Rails application, a session is created for that user. And there's actually a hash that's available to you from an application developer's point of view where you can store information for that particular session. So here's an example. Session, and you can define whatever you want here. Here I'm defining something called current user, and I'm assigning it, I'm assuming that there's a model in my code called user, and I want to save that user's ID. And this is actually a common thing to do, just to keep track of who's currently using your application. You can save the ID of who that user is from request to request using this session in this fashion. There's also another type of hash-like entity available to you, and it's called the flash. And this is a Rails-specific thing. What the flash is it allows you to pass messages between one request to the next. And here's how it works. A controller can use a flash method to display something to a user. It'll appear on the very next request. And if you look in your controller code, you'll see plenty of these flash notices. And so here, again, it looks like it's a hash called flash, and I'm defining a flash variable called notice, and I'm saying that the post was successfully created. And that, again, will be passed to the next request once this is created. And if you look at your Rails application, you'll see how this is used throughout. Now let's talk about how the response is actually rendered. So far, we've seen when we make this request, localhost 3000 post 1, the assumption is that that is HTML. And in fact, if you type .html at the end, it doesn't change anything. You'll get an HTML response. But if you look in your controller, you'll see that it's actually capable of returning JSON code as well. And JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So try this. Make the same request, but instead type .json at the end, and you'll see that it's going to return JSON code. What happens in this case is rather than invoking the show.html.erb method, if you put the .json at the end of the request, it's going to look for a show.json or show.json.builder, and it'll try and build the appropriate HTML, and that will be returned to you. So let's take a look. So I'm at the root of my blog Rails application, and I'm going to start the server. And now let's open a web page and point it to this web server. So here we are at localhost 3000, and I went to the posts index. And if I type post.html, you'll get the same thing. And here I want to demonstrate that if I type instead post.json, JSON data will be returned, and that's what this is. I'd like to take one last look at the routes that your application has defined. And if we look at this chart, there's a prefix column that I want to come back to in just a second. But if you look at the URI pattern in the middle, notice that there's a ... format there. That's saying route this post for the very top line, for the post get, route this post and include that format. So this is how it accounts for both the HTML or the JSON format that's pre-built into your Rails application. But you could define other types of formats that your application could respond to. For example, it's common to return XML data. It's not as prevalent nowadays, but if you want to build the support in so you could return XML if a user wants to receive XML, you could put a .xml there, but then you have to build additional capabilities in your controller to handle that XML response. Rails can also redirect a request. What is happening here is Rails is telling the browser to do a new request to a different URL. And here's the syntax for doing that in Rails. You just say redirect_to, that's the method that Rails has for doing this, and then you provide the URL. Rails has a bunch of shortcuts that are provided for you for doing these redirects. And you can figure out what they are by looking at that prefix that I showed you on the last slide. So if I say redirect to posts_URL, take a look at the previous slide where you see posts, and this post_URL will create the URL that was shown in the middle on that slide. So in other words, this will redirect to the index method in your post controller. Again, take a look inside your controller and other portions of your Rails application, and you'll see this used quite extensively. You can easily assign a flash message as a part of a redirection. And so again, look inside your controller and you'll see something like this, redirect to post. And that at post, when you actually supply that object, what that does is that's the same as typing post_URL. And then this is going to pass on the message that will be displayed in the next rendering of HTML that the post was successfully created. Again, it's used extensively in your application. And so let's take a look. Let's go to the root of our Rails application and open up the Rails console. And so this loads our development environment for Rails inside of the interactive Ruby shell. And the first thing I want to show you is this helper method. So there's an app object associated with your Rails application. And if you type app posts URL, this will give you the URL associated with post, which is actually the index method we know for our post controller. Now, what is this www.example.com? It's the default host that Rails uses unless you supply something otherwise. And typically, this would be set within your application. I can set it as a part of this method. So here I've done that. I've set the host as www.blogspot.com, and then it generates a URL that now uses that host. There's another helper method that you can use inside of Rails that is attached to this post object. So if I say posts path, it'll give us the path to post relative to the root of the application. So it just uses it just says \post in this case. And if you need to get the URL for a particular post, let's go ahead and retrieve one from the database. So I'm going to create a variable called @post, and I'm going to retrieve it by doing find, and I'll get the post with ID 1, and there it is. And so now if I want to get post URL, and you can again determine which URL you need to use by going to rake routes, look at the prefix there, and then attach this _URL, and then you'll see what URL that this will generate. So I'm going to supply this @post, and you'll see that it generates this particular route. Now let me show you how this redirect works inside our post controller. Let's open up again the post controller.rb file under controllers, and let's take a look at the create method. And we'll see what happens with the create method is the first thing it tries to do is create a new post based upon the post parameters that were supplied. And these post parameters, we'll see, are going to be supplied through a form that is provided in a view. And if this new post is created, it's going to be assigned to this instance variable. And then there's a respond to method that's called, and it checks the format. And if the format is HTML, we'll see that if we are able to save the post, then it'll execute this line. And this line says redirect. Rather than rendering HTML, just redirect to this URL. Now, what is this URL? This is actually shorthand for post_URL, like this. So this is just shorthand for that, and the notice will be supplied as well. This is a flash notice, and this is a shorthand way of doing this flash notice. In the case of success, this flash notice will be supplied, and the message post was successfully created will be displayed when you go to this show method. So let's take a look at that show method. Here it is. And you'll see that at the very top, this notice is actually rendered. So if there was a successful save, it would be rendered right here, and then it would show the actual post next. And again, we'll look more at this in the next module. Now, if you're not able to save the post, then what happens is the new action inside this post controller will be rendered instead, and we'll attempt to create a new post again. This completes the 7th lecture in Module 5.